Welcome back to Carneades.org. Today we're going to be continuing with our series, A Case for Free Speech with John Stuart Mill. In this video we're going to be looking at Donald Trump versus the corn dealers. Now, John Stuart Mill was one of the strongest advocates of free speech. His theories formed the basis for the U.S. legal precedent on free speech, which is one of the most permissive in the world. His famous work on liberty is a strong and passionate defense of the absolute right to free speech, the claim that we should respect the rights of people to make claims that are false, make claims that are unpopular, and make claims that are controversial, regardless of those claims themselves, because people should have a right to free speech. However, even Mill put limits on the extent of free speech that should be permissible. He famously made this distinction with reference to corn dealers. He argues that writing in the press that corn dealers starve the poor or are bad people is absolutely permissible and should be defended. But saying those same words in front of an angry mob outside the home of a corn dealer is going too far. Here's the quote. On the contrary, even opinions lose their immunity when the circumstances in which they are expressed are such as to constitute their expression a positive instigation to some mischievous act. An opinion that corn dealers are starvers of the poor, or that private property is robbery, ought to be unmolested when simply circulated through the press, but may justly incur punishment when delivered orally to an excited mob assembled before the house of a corn dealer, or when handed about among the same mob in the form of a placard. Acts of whatever kind, which, without justifiable cause, do harm to others, may be, and in the more important cases absolutely required to be, controlled by unfavorable sentiments, and, when needful, by the active interference of mankind. Now, this is where former President Trump comes in. I don't intend to get into all of the many arrests and indictments, nearly 100 criminal charges against him in several states, or the legality of any of those charges. Rather, we're going to talk about ethics here, and we're going to talk about the morality of a specific action. I want to hone in on the specific situation of speaking to an angry mob on January 6th outside the Capitol building, where he accused members of the legislature of being corrupt and committing fraud, and then told that angry mob to go to the Capitol and, quote, "If you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore." Trump and his lawyers have justified these actions based on his right to free speech. The question I want to ask is whether John Stuart Mill, the most ardent defender of a maximalist understanding of the right to free speech, would defend such statements as moral. While Mill would have defended Trump's right to speech in many cases, it seems that the clear answer here is no, if only because it is such a clear analog to the corn dealer's example. Mill would likely have defended Trump's right to make most of the claims that he made about the election up to that point, excluding things like Trump's private threats of Georgia election officials to commit fraud by finding votes for him, as direct threats to harm someone likely going to cross this threshold as well. But at least his public statements would likely have defended them, because although these claims were false and unsupported by any evidence, Mill strongly advocated against censorship of any kind, particularly of minority opinions. However, by maligning the representatives of Congress in front of an angry mob outside of their place of business, he crossed the line, not to mention gathering that mob in the first place and telling them that they need to fight. If there are any questions, the later actions of that mob doing real harm to people and property proves that Trump's speech went beyond the ethical parameters laid out by Mill, because the only reason we should limit speech is to prohibit real tangible harm. 7 people died because of Trump's words. That is real, tangible harm that even Mill would not defend. In one of the many cases against Trump, the judge actually cited John Stuart Mill as a reason that the free speech defense was insufficient, comparing Trump's actions to exactly this case of inciting a mob in front of a corn dealer's house. This raises some interesting questions of where claims on social media fall within Mill's views, as some of Trump's claims on social media have been used against him in other indictments. Is saying things that incite violence to a mob of Twitter followers more similar to writing something in a newspaper or yelling it to the mob in person? I suspect that Mill would claim that this is actually protected speech, since the harm those people can do is largely virtual, sending unkind comments, other emails, etc. In other words, more speech, which is probably going to be protected itself. This is with the exception of extortions to violence or do harm in the real world. If you're telling people to send emails to their congressperson telling them they don't like what they did, that's more like organizing and free speech than it is actual intimidation. But doxing, on the other hand, the revealing of someone's real-world address and information about them, would probably not be moral under Mill's framework, because this seems a lot more like pointing the mob at the corn dealer's home, even if it's a virtual mob. Check out our earlier video in the series on political correctness for more on some of the different kinds of harm and how the virtual world may look importantly different from extorting these things in the real world. However, when you actually look at the indictments, these tweets are often cited not as the criminal acts themselves, but as proof of other criminal acts. If I send an email saying, "I'm planning to murder my brother at 11 a.m. on Saturday," that might be protected speech. But if my brother then ends up getting murdered on Saturday at 11 a.m., seems like that statement could and should be used as proof that I did murder my brother. Similarly, if I send an email asking someone to say, "Go murder my brother on Saturday at 11 a.m., I'll pay you $100, certainly a cheap price for a murder for hire, but that statement in and of itself can be criminal. It's not making the statement necessarily that you're prosecuted for, but rather the fact that you murdered your brother, or you hired someone to murder your brother. And your statement is evidence of that, or is a piece of that puzzle. In isolation, the statement may be allowed, but as a process of a larger crime, it's likely illegal. In many cases, Trump's tweets fall into this category, where he is admitting wrongdoing online. The charge is not necessarily that the statements were wrong, but rather that they were proof of his other wrongdoing, or were a part of a broader wrongdoing. Mill would likely not defend such statements, because it's not the speech itself that is in question. It is merely being used as evidence of the further non-speech crime. It's not that Trump is being prosecuted for saying these things, but rather that he is being prosecuted for a crime, and his saying these things is evidence that he organized that crime, brought the people together to commit that crime, paid people off to commit that crime, and did the crime himself. What do you think? Ignoring the rest of the case, did Trump's words that day violate Mill's harm principle? Were they equivalent to saying that corn dealers starved the poor to an angry mob in front of a corn dealer's house? What he did moral, regardless of its legal standing? Should public admissions that you are engaging in criminal activities be able to be used to prosecute those activities? Or are admissions of guilt in some way protected under free speech? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Watch this video and more here at Carneades.org, and stay skeptical, everybody.